Welcome to Groups This Week. As a church, we exist to help all people become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We believe doing life together is a crucial part of that journey. During this time, we're going to unpack and dig deeper into the sermon we heard this past week. Let's dive in as we continue to grow in our faith, knowledge, and love of Jesus together. Well, hey, welcome community groups. This past week, we were looking at 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 to 27. And Brad, this is quite a dicey
just
passage.
To keep it light. To keep it light. Yeah.
Antichrist, like all of that.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think like up front, like there can be so many heated questions maybe around this passage. So I just want to ask you those questions. Like,
oh, thanks.
Yeah, we see in verse 18 it says, "Children, it is the last hour," and then he goes on to talk about Antichrist.
Yeah.
So I mean, in your research, in your assessment, when is the last hour that John's talking about, and who or what is the Antichrist?
Okay. Well, first of all, I love that this was in the section last week as well, but just the idea that just John's approach of referring to this congregation as children. And so he has this great compassion and this love. But then I love just the contrast. But so children, it's the last hour, the Antichrist, you've heard about it. I just find kind of funny. But I think throughout the New Testament, whenever and actually John's the only person to use this phrase, last hour. We've heard last days, the end time, things like that. But what seems to be implied when the New Testament writers talk about the last hour is it seems to be implying the time between, and when we think last hour, we think, oh, it's just at this, like it shouldn't take long. We're right here. Like it's 11 o'clock and it's almost 12 kind of thing. But in the New Testament, they tend to be talking about the epoch of time between the resurrection of Christ and his second coming. Yeah. And so if we think of it, I used to work in a high school. We think of it as like a plot line of a story. The story begins with the setting, and then a problem, and then there's rising action, and then there's the climax, and then after the climax, they call it the lowering of action, and then the conclusion. The conclusion is the last piece. So we know where things are going. We know how the story is going to end, and that's the final hour. That's the last hour. Yeah. So it's more about a chapter in time rather than it's going to happen like
within a year or whatever.
Exactly, right. And we've seen throughout church history more in the last couple centuries of the idea that, no, this is the time and we see the signs and it's going to happen. Yeah.
Those dang unspecified periods of time, hey?
Yep.
Just very vague in general, but the time is approaching.
Yeah. And I mean, you even hear, like, even Peter, they start to, it sounds like they're getting a little concerned that this last hour is taking longer than they would like, because even Peter says, but just remember that a day is like 100 years and 100 years like a day to God. So that we're not on our time schedule, we're on God's time schedule. Yeah.
And how about the Antichrist? What's this all about here?
Well, one of the things we need to be careful. Again, John is the only one who uses the word Antichrist. And often when I think modern day Christians, people who grew up in the church, when they see the word Antichrist, they're immediately jumping to Revelation and maybe to 2 Thessalonians, the man of lawlessness, where Paul writes that. But that's assuming a lot and jumping into a lot of other conclusions before we even get there. The word Antichrist, even though John's the only one who uses it, he never uses it in Revelation. The word Antichrist is not in Revelation. He only actually uses it in 1 John and 2 John. But the word Antichrist basically is against the anointed one. Christos, the anointed one. Against, or pushing against. But there does seem to be an implication here that he's pointing to a future character. There's both a singular use here in verse 18 as well as a plural use. So we could probably deduce by looking at some of those other things that there is a certain historical character that will show up, that will fulfill some of these things. What's interesting in this text is John passes right by that. His concern is not this figure, which they've heard of. I don't know exactly what he means. When did they hear about this? Is it in the writings of Paul, or is it just in conversation? But he says, it's the last hour, and just as you heard the Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have appeared. So basically he's saying, that's not your problem.
Right.
Your problem right now is that there's They're here. They're among you. Don't worry about that one. You've got them in your midst right now, and that's a real problem you need to deal with. Yeah. And it moves on to say what that means. They're denying that Jesus is the Son of God. They're opposing Christ, God's anointed one. Mm-hmm. So that's the main concern of John's text here. Mm-hmm. Is not this future character. In fact, don't get concerned with that.
Yeah.
You need to deal with these antichrists right now.
So what I hear you saying is like it's likely that there is like a future antichrist, a figure who will be opposed to Christ, and at the same time there are many antichrists throughout the course of history, and in John's context there are those opposed to Christ within the vicinity of his audience, and they need to be aware of how they might be led astray and what might some of those things be. Like how might they be tempted to stray from Christ?
The Antichrist, or
I guess just like John's hearers, like as he's writing this book.
I think so. So John's big concern in 1 John is how much he loves he loves Jesus and he loves the truth, mm-hmm. and then a great distaste for anyone who would pull people away from that truth.
Yeah.
So that's the theme of the letter, and so. An antichrist is anyone who's going to pull you away from the truth. In the first chapter, we talk about living in the light and not in the darkness. So someone who's going to pull you into the darkness. One of those ways, like it goes on to say, is questioning whether Jesus is the anointed. So we've probably been talking about this at the different campuses over this week. This Gnostic idea that mm-hmm. Jesus, a man, someone in flesh, cannot be the anointed one of God, because flesh is filthy and spirit is good. Therefore, this Jesus could not be mm-hmm. the Son of God. Mm-hmm. So anyone who's saying that, John says, is an antichrist.
Wow. And
you shouldn't listen to them. And what's really cool going on here is he says, so there's antichristos, the anti of the anointed. And then what does he go on to say? He says, but you are the anointed. You are the Christus. You are the anointed. So you have Christus, you have antichristos, and then you have Christus.
Okay.
So be aware of those who are against the anointed one, but don't worry, you are the anointed. Which is a fascinating thing going on there.
Yeah.
And in being anointed, the Spirit has given you a radar for truth. So mm-hmm. hold on to that mm-hmm. truth. Yeah. And be aware of those who would try to steal that from you.
We'll get into the whole testing of spirits later in like the
it's coming up.
1 John.
We won't spoil it
for sure. So you're kind of touching on
charisma. I said Christus. Charisma is the word for anointing.
Okay.
Anointed, yeah.
Okay. That's helpful to know.
Yeah.
So Brad, you're kind of talking about like a way of checking, like, okay, is someone for or against Christ? And so I want to read like verses 22 and 23 and then just ask you about the implications that these verses have. So it reads, who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever confesses the Son has the Father also. So my question is like, what implications do these verses hold for other religions or religious pluralism? Can you speak to that for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually quite straightforward. I think in our modern world, we're afraid to say it, but there's only one way to the Father, and that's through the Son. I think of even the reason many don't want to say that is many in the world like the concept of a benevolent God, but the challenge of Christ is very difficult. Yeah. I think of Chesterton saying it's not that Christianity has been tried and found difficult. It's that it's been found difficult and not tried. And so I think of in the Gospel of John chapter 6, where Jesus has given some very difficult teaching and many people have walked away. And he says to the disciples, are you guys going to leave too? And Peter, in one of his good moments, says, where else are we going to go? Only you have the words of eternal life. And so it's pretty blatant throughout John's gospel, John's letter here, that the implications are that Jesus is the only way to the Father, and there's no other path. Now, today we have spirituality and we have Christianity. And people like spirituality because spirituality is kind of the smorgasbord where you can just take the parts that you like. But John makes it clear, Jesus makes it clear, you take me. That's I am the way to the Father. I am the way to spiritual, emotional health.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, this is like pretty pointed, but like I was reading in a commentary kind of prepping for our time together this morning about how the author of this commentary was saying like even like religions like Islam or Judaism or Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, where maybe they like believe in the Old Testament texts and claim to worship like the same God we do, because they deny the reality of who the Son is. According to John's words here, no one who denies the Son has the Father, and so we can't say you're actually worshiping the same God we are.
Absolutely.
Or you're worshiping the same Father.
Right.
Because you've denied the Son.
Yeah.
And so I think that's maybe a question that like is kind of out there of like, okay, are Muslims or, Orthodox Jews or Jehovah's Witnesses following the same God, but they're just kind of off with the Son.
Right.
But
no,
if we look explicitly in this text, the answer is no.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, hey, thanks so much, Brad, for sitting down with us and going into Antichrist in the last hour. So
anytime.
Beautiful. Well, why don't you guys take some time to discuss through this passage?
We hope you enjoyed the teaching today. If you're wanting to follow along with our community group's discussion guide with your group, you can head to cachurch.ca/media, where you can find the discussion guide. Not only are there questions there related to the sermon, but there's also prayer prompts that relate to the passage or the topic that we were talking about, and practices that you can, on an individual level or a group level, begin integrating into your life to not only bring this knowledge into your mind, but to begin living it out.